and I think people will continue to come in and Erica will let them in. Jefferson, I love your comment in the chat that you don't know where you're from anymore. I'm not quite sure what's behind that, but that's great. Currently in Taos. So we're delighted as part of Ruby's briefing series to have with us today Chloe Maxmin, state senator from the state of Maine, and Canyon Woodward, originally from rural North Carolina. And Chloe and Canyon are a dynamic duo in multiple levels. Chloe started her political career, I guess you would say 4-ish years ago, when she ran for the House in a very rural part of Maine and won her House seat, beating an incumbent. The following cycle, she entered the race for the Senate district that encompassed, I think, most of her House seat. And again, a very predominantly rural district with a powerful Republican incumbent, won again. And through it all, Canyon was her campaign manager. And so what they're going to be talking to us about today is what they learned about how they pulled that off. And they've put a lot of those lessons, probably most of them, in their remarkable book, which we highly recommend, and hopefully somebody will post a link to in the chat, which is called Dirt Road Revival. So we're thrilled, and we're also thrilled that Chloe and Canyon are and have been partners of Ruby for almost a year now. So this is they're wonderful contributors to the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative, and as well their own efforts in politics and now in trying to educate and motivate the larger democratic groups out there. So I'm going to turn it over to Chloe and Canyon. They're going to present for roughly 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Feel free to put questions in the chat box. If the group gets really big, we'll read your questions. If we stay relatively small, we will ask you to unmute and ask your question. So Chloe, Canyon, want to go ahead and get us started?
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Erica, for having us, and all of the time and effort y'all put into this awesome group. Excited to make this a conversation and talk about whatever folks are interested in, but we can start off with just kind of some of the high level background and lessons learned through our organizing experiences. I am from a super rural conservative part of Western North Carolina, in the mountains here, Madison Cawthorn's district, soon to be formerly. And I grew up, I would say, like fairly apolitical, at least in terms of electoral politics. It always felt very, very distant and kind of slimy and rotten to me, and I had really no interest in taking part. I remember one of my earliest run-ins with politics was through this DOT project in our community where they were trying to demolish this old historic bridge in our community and replace it with a slab of concrete. And the community was up in arms about it, and they held a public hearing, and we just packed the house in the basement of this old Baptist church at the end of the road. I'd never seen so many folks from our community in one place together before, and one after another, we just got up and kind of let them have it over how much we did not want their project to go through. And there's this older gentleman sitting up towards the front who was just sitting there silent and listening the whole time. And at the end, he popped up and turned to all of us, and he was like, "I'm so-and-so." I won't name names, but he said, "I'm one of your county commissioners, and I just came here tonight to listen. And this is democracy in action, and this project will not go through." And he got this huge standing ovation from all of us. And then What do you know? A week or two later, the project came up for a vote, and he voted in favor of it, along with the majority of the commissioners, and the project went through. As like a 16-year-old, you know, it wasn't a life or death kind of issue. It's kind of a little something of a silly issue in retrospect, but that just hurt so bad. It was just like, damn, this is exactly the sleaziness that I've always imagined politics and politicians to be. And yeah, it was a real gut punch. And then I got to work on Bernie's campaign in 2015 and 2016, and obviously suffering through Trump's election was another gut punch. And I think in both of those, there's kind of a choice to make of like, do you let it deter you and push you away, or do you hold your nose and wade into the muck and do your best to try and make some positive change in the other direction. And I was super fortunate to have met Chloe in college doing climate organizing, and she called me up one day and told me that she was going to run for state representative back in her hometown in Maine. And so got to move up there and work with her for the better part of the last 5 years on her campaigns in this super rural conservative district, that the state house district that she ran for in 2018 had gone Republican by 16 points on average over the last 3 cycles, which is a huge deficit to overcome. And it was, I think we saw it large in a larger frame of view as kind of like, can we bring these organizing lessons from climate organizing to a more conservative rural space where the Democratic Party, it felt like, had kind of written these folks off. And working on the Bernie campaign and a local campaign in North Carolina before that, felt like we had seen some trends of where the party was going wrong in terms of not even really trying to persuade folks anymore. In North Carolina, we'd had the party pull resources at the last minute to pay for TV ads in like Charlotte, Mecklenburg, rather than funds that were promised to our campaign down the stretch in this rural district. And during GOTV, volunteers were called off from reaching out to voters in the mountains to instead, again, call into Charlotte to boost turnout. And that's kind of a larger trend in the party of not investing in the conversations that can change people's minds and persuade folks, and instead leaning way too much on demographic shifts that they have believed will carry us to victory if only we can turn out our core supporters. And that choice to prioritize turnout in Democratic strongholds rather than persuasion of moderate voters has cost us election after election, to the point where we're in such a hole that we can hardly remember that it wasn't like this very recently. And in fact, if you look back to as recently as just 2009, the partisan lean of rural voters was evenly split, which feels kind of crazy today. Today it's about a 16-point gap. And so to us, Chloe's success in Maine, getting elected in these conservative rural districts, was proof that those dogmas that have governed American politics, or at least the politics of the DNC and the Democratic Party, could and should be challenged. And yeah, I think the core of our approach is just digging into those face-to-face conversations, grassroots organizing, going and meeting people where they are, listening, forming human connections, and really being authentically out there in the community. And when you do that, you can share in people's frustration with the system as it is, and you can form connections that that win people over who you wouldn't otherwise expect. And so I think that was one of the most powerful things we discovered. I would say one of the other big things was not relying so much on political consultants. I think in Maine, they gave us like a sample budget that the party wanted us to use. And I think, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, it doesn't really matter, but I think something like 3/5 or 4/5 was supposed to go towards these consultants that spit out the same kind of material cycle after cycle, and goes in the garbage can. And we decided to instead design all of that stuff ourselves and find our own printer using the local newspaper, do hand painted campaign signs. And I think, well, one, that saved a lot of money. We reached a lot more people. And I think it also showed an authenticity that resonated with voters. So those are a couple of reflections from our end, and I'll turn it over to Chloe.
Hi, everyone. My name's Chloe. I'm calling in from Warren, Maine, and I'm farming this summer, and I've been outside sweating all day, and I'm looking at myself in this camera and realizing how sweaty I look. So I'm really sorry for that. I'm in our garlic shed right now. I don't know if you can see all the garlic hanging. But I think Canyon just summarized it all so well. I grew up in Maine in a small town of 1,600 folks on my family's farm. And I've just really always loved my hometown so much. I say it often in almost every speaking thing or interview that we do, but it's really just so true. I really cherish my community. I mean, I love it because it's really beautiful. It's a little too hot right now. Climate change is not increasing my love for the summertime. But when I was growing up, I remember just I really don't have many clear memories of politics, of talking about politics with my neighbors, with all the people who raised me. And it wasn't until I got access to the voter database in 2018 that I'd look up all of these folks. I was just like, oh, I'm just curious where they are. And they were very hardcore Republican, like not even in our Canvas universe level hardcore Republican. And I didn't know, we have these really deep relationships, and they're part of who I am. And then, when I kind of learned all the information, I just realized how when I left my hometown and went to, lived in different parts of Maine, or lived in Boston when we went to college, just how that foundation of having relationships that are based on values and not whether you have a D or an R next to your name, just how really special that is. And it's been really sad over the last couple cycles door knocking in my hometown area to see how I really feel like that part of who I am and the community that raised me. I feel like it's disappearing, that our ability to have conversations that are really centered on values and kindness is really quickly disappearing. I think this is something that Canyon and I started to sense in both of our hometowns after Trump got elected in 2016. And, at my House district and my Senate district, they both voted for Trump in 2016. And so kind of reckoning with this love that I have for my community, but also the role that my community was playing in really tilting our country towards a really dangerous path. So much of what Canyon and I did with our campaigns was really intentionally from day one, start with a vision of, okay, how do we rebuild some conversation between us and conservative folks in rural places? What does that look like? And we would have these big pieces of butcher paper, and we'd write down our vision and our dreams and our theory of change and what was needed and the resources that we had, and we just kind of sketched it all out. And that informed so much of kind of how we approached campaigning. We had both worked on other campaigns, both volunteered on other campaigns, both experienced the extractiveness of traditional campaigning, both for the volunteer where you just kind of show up, you have a really disempowering canvassing experience with not great conversations with folks, and you're following a generic script. When I've done it, I've been by myself. I've been given really bad snacks. You go back to the campaign headquarters and then you leave all by yourself. And it's just, ugh, like, I don't think I would do it again. I love this work. And then from the voters' perspective, folks are really used to having their door knocked on a bunch of times and being asked the same questions. And in traditional campaigning, there's not really like a conversation there. It's just like, where do you rank on your support for this candidate? And do you know what time your polling place is open? So we really wanted to do it differently. And I think it was also really interesting for us because deep canvassing is a term that's really popular now. Neither of us had ever heard of that term when we started campaigning. And stumbling upon it seems like a bit of a trite way to explain it, but it's kind of what it felt like, where we were just having these conversations with folks that were so different and so challenging. And really what we could do and what we could teach our volunteers to do was just to listen. And through that act of listening, which we later came to realize, it felt like a pretty radical thing to listen to these folks who are so different from us. But it created empathy, and it created respect for different stories, and respect for people's motivations. And obviously I don't agree with voting for Trump, but I come to really understand so much of what my community feels and why folks are leaning that way in a way that I never ever did before. So there was just such a completely eye-opening, soul-changing experience to kind of dig into these kinds of conversations that we know are at the heart of a really important political moment. Where are we going to be torn towards these really dangerous narratives and paradigms that the right is forcing down our throats, or are we going to be able to resist and turn things the other way? And if we're going to turn the other way, we're going to need everyone, including rural voters, and we're especially going to need our state legislatures. So I think that's what we did. And along the way, we would take voice memos, and we had a Google Doc where we'd just throw ideas and observations and news links. And by the time we were done, we were like, oh my gosh, we learned so much, since we kind of put things intentionally into practice. We knew what worked and what didn't work, and what might work in other places. And that kind of coalesced into the book, Dirt Road Revival. And now we've started a C4 called Dirt Road Organizing to kind of carry forth this work and make sure that rural candidates got the support that they need to run and win. So I will stop there.
Wonderful. You guys were very succinct. You only took 20 minutes, barely that. So we've got a lot of time for questions and discussion, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of that. I'm looking through the chat, seeing a lot of commendation of you all, but not a question just yet. So I'll open it up to see if anyone wants to get the ball rolling with a question about any piece of it, the campaigns themselves, the lessons learned, anything else like that. Jeffrey has a question. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much. It's always good to be around other rural folks. So earlier you said that we were making a mistake by focusing on turning out Democrats, as I understood it. What role should turning out Democrats be, especially in those more red districts? I live in Walla Walla, and our district is, I believe, 60% Republican, or 57% Republican, and 43% Democrat. So how would you work in a district like that if you're not going to focus as much on turnout?
Yeah, I mean, you have to turn out your supporters. That is winning campaigns 101. But the issue that we're getting at is more on like a statewide scale. It's easy for so generally how things work is the top of the ticket campaigns, your presidential, your US Senate, your governor's race, they kind of call the shots on where the lion's share of resources are deployed in the state, statewide through the coordinated campaigns. And overwhelmingly that has been focusing on the most densely populated areas, cities, and increasingly suburbs, to the exclusion of everywhere else. And that, that can work, although it hasn't much, for a statewide where it's just all of the votes from the whole state, but it's at the expense of every other race, congressional races, and much more so state legislative races in rural parts of the state. So I would say you do still need to turn out your core folks, but we have to invest a ton more resources in being willing to go out and talk to folks face to face in rural areas as well, and put, it's not an either or, but we need to be putting a lot more time, effort, and money into having those conversations with the winnable moderate voters that we've kind of written off.
Chloe, did you want to add anything to that?
I think one thing that was really important in our race was the structure of the Lincoln County Democrats, or local county Democratic Committee. And we definitely could not have won without them and all their amazing organizing, because they really helped us with our Democratic turnout while we could focus on having lots of deep conversations with our conservative universe. I think a lot of times candidates have to do like all of the Democratic canvassing and then just do as much Republican and independent as possible. And so I think what I'm getting at is, and I know we're all on the same page here, but the kind of the disinvestment from the Democratic Party of local infrastructures is really to the detriment of our ability to be able to have these conversations with everybody. And so, you know, if we can keep building up our county Democratic committees and our indivisibles and all of the groups that have the capacity to do that kind of canvassing with Democrats, it really frees up campaigns to focus on a different body of voters that we can totally win and totally talk to, but we just usually don't have the time to talk to them. So it becomes like a unfortunate calculus.
Thank you. And we've got a lot of questions. I'm going to add one quick comment from my experience running for Congress, which is that I found that a lot of sort of former Democrats who'd quit voting, who were kind of fed up with politics and fed up with the party, were energized by the right kind of campaign with a good, solid bread and butter message. So I think when you do what you all did, you not only persuade people from the other side, but there is some motivation of our side, at least people who've kind of fallen away from things a bit. At least I felt that. I don't know if you all saw that. We've got a bunch of questions and we've got some in the chat box. So I'm going to go next to Ellen. If you'd unmute yourself, Ellen. Ellen, can you unmute? If not, I'll move to somebody else.
Okay,
Okay,
I figured
good.
it out. This has been a bit squirrely trying to get connected. I was quite curious about the issues, Chloe, that you found were the most I guess, productive to have with your rural conservative voters. How did you manage to connect on issues?
I think I was really surprised when I started canvassing that I was kind of told to be prepared for the big issues and just get very well educated on, you know, education and healthcare and property taxes and all those things. And those issues definitely did come up, but predominantly what people would talk about is just how they feel so let down by government and politicians, and just like swindled by everyone who's ever knocked on their door, and just so unserved by this body that's supposed to serve us. And that was just by far the most common thing that I would hear. And that's something that I could definitely relate with, because that's exactly why I was running for office. You know, we were all coming at it from a different perspective. You know, for me, it was, I just can't watch folks many generations older than I am continue to vote against climate policy. Like, what's going on? Let's go into the system and try and figure that out. But for some folks, it's, you know, I've worked my whole life and I can't afford to retire. I've been told that I can live on Social Security and I can't. So I'm 80 years old and I'm going to work at the supermarket, and that's the fault, which it is. So, you know, there was a lot of common ground there I could find. Not always, but the vast majority of the time.
Yeah, not to write off communicating on issues completely, but I think what a lot of the party establishment doesn't understand is that rural life, especially everyone, but rural life is rooted in these shared values, like we've talked about: independence, common sense, hard work, tradition, frugality, community. And our campaigns, you know, you can go on the website and you get white papers and these long lists of policy, but that doesn't capture people's hearts and minds and trust. And our experience, politicians tends to lose people when they regurgitate these politically triangulated lines and go super deep into hitting people over the head with policy. Folks vote on what rings true and personal to them, and what hits them emotionally. Leaning into storytelling is super important. And again, those face-to-face conversations where folks can ask the question, can this person be trusted? Is she authentic?
Thank you, Chloe and Canyon. And Edward has posted a little excerpt related to your book about this issue. You folks can read in the chat. Barbara, if you'd unmute and ask your question.
So I'm currently reading your book when I saw that Ruby was having this, and I was absolutely delighted. My question is, I currently work on single payer, and not for long, I'm probably going to move into media literacy. But reading your book and listening to the two of you, how can you get to progressive Democrats who seem to be so stuck in their own patting each other on the back? They refuse to go into the rural areas, the communities. I don't even want to use areas. There's this disconnectedness. And I mean, I live in Ithaca, which is surrounded by rural communities. People do not want to make relationships. And I have a storytelling workshop, absolutely refuse. So any suggestions that, you know, you could write something to them to get them to see things differently? You're proof that things can work, you know, but you have to put in the energy, the time, and meet the challenge. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. It's super hard. I don't feel like I have a good answer for it. I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we face is that echo chamber that we create for ourselves of, you know, like just the natural instincts to make other people wrong and make ourselves right, which gets us absolutely nowhere, except both sides dug in deeper to where we already are. And I don't know how we change that other than, you know, continuing to push people to be willing to hold nuance and engage in those conversations, go out and canvas and give deep canvassing and listening a real try. I think that's a good antidote, and telling stories of success, and just being willing to have the discomfort of calling that out when you see it. But that's a good question. I don't know.
Maybe your next book.
Well, isn't your book, I mean, Chloe, maybe you can respond, but isn't your book in part a book written not just for rural organizers and candidates, but for the Democratic establishment to try to shake things up, or am I misreading that?
Yeah, the book is definitely written for a more of a Democratic audience. I think, yeah, I really feel like everything is so uncomfortable these days. And as Democrats, like, we're so uncomfortable, almost every identity is under assault. And so I think it's understandable to not want to go compound your discomfort by having a conversation with someone who you see as creating your discomfort. That all makes sense to me. But I think also it's only going to make things worse if we don't have these conversations, or at least attempt to, because these issues that the Republicans are turning into wedge issues there will be no space for conversations on them, and they will define elections, and it's going to be really, really bad. Just a little quick anecdote. I've just gotten off of doing 5 deep canvassing trainings with our Lincoln County Democrats, because they're doing a whole deep program this summer. And it was all hardcore Dems that came to the training, and Dems who were just, so livid at what's happening in the world and who could never imagine knocking on a Republican's door. But we were doing these role plays, and everyone had to take a turn role playing a conservative voter. And in every single one of these trainings, these hardcore Democrats were embodying the voice and the narrative of Republicans so well that I was basically convinced that they were a Republican voter, standing on a doorstep. It was so interesting to me how people, like, somehow on the inside kind of knew what to say. They could carry on a 5 or 6 minute conversation through the lens of a conservative Republican. And so I feel like that empathy is in there. Like, we're not totally walled off to what people are seeing or experiencing. And it kind of made me hopeful that, maybe those barriers aren't as tough inside us as we may think.
That's very encouraging, and I'll say, frankly, surprising. That's really cool. I'm going to shift to the chat box for a question. We still have Alicia, Sarah, Jefferson, and Erica who have their hands up, but Beverly's had a couple of questions in the chat box. I'll just speak them real quick. The first is that she says, and she's in Yancey County. I assume that's Yancey County, North Carolina, although I'm not sure. Okay, great. She says she's finding strong reluctance to canvass, I guess, from Dems because of the hostility that they're experiencing or expecting from Trump supporters who are in the majority, and that a lot of the potential canvassers are retirees, elderly folks. So it's, what do you do about that? That's one part of her question. Her second part is, how do you recruit young folks? And you guys both being young folks, it'd be particularly interesting to hear if you had any particular emphasis on that. And then the third part of Beverly's questions is, how do we communicate with a wider range of folks in a rural area when there's sort of no political ads on the radio of a Democratic or liberal nature? The letters to the editor are all kind of on one side. So a 3-part question there before we move on to some of our others.
May I say one thing? We have no letters to the editor. They are not allowed.
Oh my.
And the political ads in the local radio got so toxic that they've taken them down. So that's it. No political ads and no letters to the editor.
Wow.
And that was primarily due to the Cawthorn hostile Republican primary, that and our local Republicans that were running for clerk of court got really hostile. But this is an incredibly hostile space. And when I first started really knocking on doors in 2017 and 18, because I liked knocking on doors, that's my favorite thing to do, because that's why I love your book. It's exactly my experience. That's where you learn where people are, what their stories are, what they like to talk about. But, by 2018, towards the end, you were met with guns, you were met with a fair amount of stuff. It wasn't that hostile. I'm a pediatric nurse and I'm used to knocking on doors and not used to being afraid of it. But I mostly did most of the precincts, except the more close-in precincts, because nobody else wanted to go out there and meet people. Now our situation is that we have many more unaffiliated than we have either of the two parties, more Republicans than we have Democrats. And we are an aging population all the way around. So now what I'm trying to figure out, and we'll have a meeting tomorrow about this again. I have already read your book, but I was excited about your book, so I pre-ordered it because it was my experience. So I'm a convert. But I'm trying to figure out, what am I going to say? How am I going to focus it? And how am I going to kind of direct things? Our local candidates have got the message. That's the message they want to send, is that we grew up here. We hear you, we want to talk to you. And so we're going to have porch parties as kind of a small gathering. So everybody didn't have to knock on isolated doors, which is very, very time consuming. But I will hush, but I'm anxious to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Beverly.
Well, definitely feel free to chime in, Anthony or Cynthia, or other folks who probably have a great deal of experience and wisdom to add. I think a handful of things come first to mind to me. One is different ways to kind of ease people into it, depending on who we're talking about. One thing that we did sometimes in our campaigns is we would start folks off with kind of less hostile doors based on our targeting, rather than going to folks who had a score of 40 on a 0 to 100 in likelihood to support a Democrat. Maybe we'd have them canvass, a 55 to 70 block of voters, so that they're less likely to run into the extremely hostile conversations for their first experience. So that's one thing that you can do to kind of ease folks and get them comfortable. Another thing that we did is sending people out with partners. There are a lot of folks who are like, I really want to help out. I want to volunteer. I just, canvassing is not for me. Is there a place for me in the campaign? And we'd be like, heck yeah, we need drivers. And what that was, as much as anything, was just kind of like emotional support out there, so that if you do run into hostile door, at least you come back to a friend in the car to debrief with and carry on, rather than being in that solo. And we also found that a lot of those folks, over time, getting to sit there in the driveway and hear some of the conversations and see it go down, it became a lot less scary. And some of them ended up going and canvassing themselves after getting to drive people around for a while. I think another big thing is trying to make it fun as much as possible, and build community through it, so that it's not just about the act of going out and canvassing, but it's also just like folks want to come back for the relationships, for the community, because it's fun. We would always have folks come back at the same time, whether they'd finished the whole target list or not, so that we could all be there together to debrief and share out stories and tough conversations, funny conversations, celebrate the good ones. Sometimes we would have food. We'd always have a speaker set up with music, and just trying to make it a space where people get that fulfillment of community that will bring them back. And as far as the young folks question, I think a couple things come to mind. One is like paying people, if you can have the resources, do that in a campaign, paying young folks, and then also mentoring and like giving real leadership roles, not just we're going to send you out with a clipboard, but if you have the capacity to give them a leadership role, to maybe build a team out themselves that they kind of have ownership of, and coach them on how to do one-on-ones and other organizing skills, and really invest in their development and their ownership within the campaign. I think that that's a way to bring young folks in and keep them coming back. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
Chloe?
I agree with everything Canyon said, and really validate and relate to what you're talking about, Beverly. I felt that same kind of precipitous decline in approachability. And in my mind, I always told myself I was disarming people with kindness. But it only goes so far, and it really takes a toll on you to be able to keep that up. But I also would love to hear if other folks on the call have thoughts on all this.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Alicia next. Beverly, one other thing just to remember is that canvassing doesn't happen in a vacuum. So I think the other efforts that Ruby and many others are making to focus on rural communities and rural development, to engage in concrete works that Democrats and liberals take on to make their local communities better, all that different stuff over time will reduce the level of hostility among a lot of people, and will kind of literally open doors to make canvassing a bit less daunting, I think. So it's part of a broader strategy. Alicia, will you unmute and ask your question, please?
Hi, thank you for being here. I am in northeastern Illinois, which is a pretty urban, north of Chicago, and then the county west of me is quite rural, but developing quickly. So I'm an environmentalist is my main focus, and my two issues are, how do I get people who are so excited to have this new home in this new subdivision in this rural area, how do I get them excited about proper land use and development, and watching the hardscaping and thinking about ecosystem services and climate change. And then also because I'm running for county board, it's 95% nonpartisan work. I just want to get elected, so I don't mention that I'm Democrat at the doors unless they ask, and because I don't want to give them a reason to shut me down before they realize, oh, I'm likable, I care, she's normal, she's a mom, and I just wonder what your thoughts on those issues are. Thank you.
On the Canyon and I often pause to give each other space to talk, so there's usually awkward silence. But I think on the second part of that, yeah, I wouldn't show up and be like, hey, I'm Chloe, I'm a Democrat, and our volunteers wouldn't lead with that either. But certainly answered if someone asked, me had it on all of our materials, so it wasn't like we were hiding it. It always angers me when candidates don't put their party on their stuff to try and hide and make it confusing. I don't like that. Okay. And I think there's just something about owning it and being authentic, and just there has to be space to have a narrative where it's I'm a Democrat, but I'm not the bad Democrat. The other one, oh my gosh, I don't know. I feel like it's so community specific. I guess I feel like folks where I live are really, really want to keep the land exactly the way it is, so that our traditional of the land can continue. But
right.
But I think also in rural places, there seems to be such an abundance of land that some change in the use of land doesn't feel like that big a deal. So I don't know, it's complicated.
It's hard to be an environmentalist when people are paying a lot for gas, and taxes are super high up here and things like that. So
totally
not their focus. I'm trying to get as many people in the fold as I can, but they may not feel like I'm hearing them. If that is my issue, it may not be their issue because I live in a richer suburb,
Yeah. Thank you so much for what you're doing.
No, thank you. Thanks for this opportunity to listen and to learn. Thank you.
Heck yeah.
Sarah, would you ask your question?
Gladly. Thank you. Chloe, congratulations on your 2 runs. It's fantastic to have young women in office and progressives, but Kenyon, it's your brain that I want to pick. And I would love to try to have a one-on-one with you sometime, because I want to get more into the niche of helping progressives run in rural areas. I live in upstate New York. There are lots of cities and lots of seats that Democrats do not ever run for. And I am particularly interested in the campaign manager role. And so all of that intersection, like, I just want to get so nerdy about it with you. So I have the book on order, but I would just love to hear quickly, because I know we're over time, kind of what's your advice for developing campaign managers to help candidates run in local, local rural areas? Thanks.
Heck yeah. Thanks, Sarah. I'm tossing my email in the chat if you want to connect more offline. Let's see. I think that's a huge need, is campaign staff development, getting really competent campaign managers at the state legislative level. I went to, I remember in 2017, I think I went to campaign staff training put on by Lillian's List in North Carolina, which is an awesome organization helping elect more women to office down here. But I went into that feeling like, oh, like managing a campaign is something that maybe I could do like way down the road, and came out of it just realizing like what a lack of experienced campaign staff we have everywhere, certainly in North Carolina at that time, but all over the place, that basically like anyone can do it, because almost everyone, so many of the folks who are doing it don't really have any experience to speak of. And that's a huge problem. I think one of the reasons for that is just like burnout and lack of good mentorship and being able to pay people well and retain staff and bring them back cycle after cycle. But yeah, I think we have a long way to go in terms of just being able to invest in more training and mentorship and the resources to be able to pay people in a sustainable way, cycle after cycle. But super happy to connect offline and chat about it more.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Heck yeah.
Great. And I'll just mention that in response to Alicia's questions about the environmentalism and in the setting that she's in, that Paul has a very thoughtful response in the chat if you haven't already seen it, Alicia. Jefferson, would you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I think Erica was ahead of me in the queue.
That's okay. Erica's part of the.
No, go ahead.
She's part of the
Skip over
team.
me.
Okay.
She's at the bottom of the list because.
Right. Sorry. I appreciate all the comments about supporting canvassers and staff. My son drove all the way to Atlanta to help in the Georgia Senate runoff, and came back and said, forget professional politics. It's dead. There's no reason to do it. He found it a completely alienating experience. He's just part of a cog in a machine that didn't matter. So that's just a comment to thank you. I do have 2 questions, kind of interrelated. One is when you're talking to potential constituents, how do you differentiate or discuss your relationship with the left wing of the party? I'm guessing that maybe your heart is probably on some of the more left-wing issues in the party, but in fact, you need to find a place where the rubber meets the road. And so I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious about how you deal with kind of local control versus federal power in how you discuss issues. I think there's obviously a suspicion of federal authority in a lot of these places. So I welcome your answers. Thanks. And I really thank you for everything you're doing. It's just wonderful.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Jefferson. Chloe, I'll let you take those.
Heck yeah. Yeah, those are great questions. I think I would, when you walk up to the door and someone's like, are you a Democrat or a Republican? It always kind of instills fear in me, because most of the time when you say Democrat, they're like, okay, go away, I'm not going to talk with you. But if there's space to talk about that with people, I really talk about how I don't identify with the National Democratic Party. I have just as many problems with the Democrats as I do the Republicans, and I choose to be a Democrat based on my values, not based on some kind of party ideology. And so again, kind of getting back down to that values base with folks, and that usually works if they're kind of willing to hear it out. But again, I think that space of being able to kind of break through and have that conversation gets narrower and narrower every year. And yeah, in terms of local control stuff, I kind of forget how you framed the question. But in Maine, we are a very strong local control state, and I really believe in local control. So I could totally have blanked on other substantive parts of that question if you want to repeat it.
Well, I can offer an example. So I live in Nashville when I'm not here in Taos, and local control is essentially kind of this weird dance to give Republicans more control on the state level over local affairs and distance politics from federal authority, right? So it's not actually local control, but it's sort of presented that way, and it's a complicated dance, I guess, but it feels like the impulse is anti-federal authority, even though, in our case, it might be more about racial equality or something that's coming from the federal authority.
Yeah, it doesn't, I totally understand that. It doesn't quite operate that way in Maine. I actually really like our method of local control because I think it really does. I think what you're saying is it's like the same kind of paradigm, but the way it plays out here is just having a lot of community autonomy, which makes folks feel like a lot better and a lot more in control of what they can do. And so then and the state legislators really can only focus on statewide issues. There's really not much that we can do for our communities specifically, which is a bit annoying, but it's a model that works really well for us because every community is so different and has its own needs, and there's almost no way to legislate in a way that could fulfill all of those needs.
So we're almost we're beyond our normal time, but we're coming up on the half hour. I want to voice a question or two from the chat box and then give Erica the last word on the questions. And just to add one thing to what Chloe was saying in response to Jefferson is, we know without a doubt that one of the big issues that rural people have about the federal government is it perceiving that it's extremely intrusive. Whether it's environmental or health or anything else, it's always telling us what to do. And if we know one thing, it's that people are sick and tired of other people telling them what to do. So one approach, I think, because there are certain things that have to be federally driven, is wherever possible, speak the language and promote the policies where the federal government is enabling local communities or incentivizing local communities or encouraging local communities to solve their own problems as much as possible, rather than mandating cookie cutter solutions. So that's a very generic thing, but you can find real examples. Occasionally the federal government gets it right and does it that way. So the question I wanted to ask from the chat is from Cynthia, where she's, and then Erica, you jump in after Chloe and Canyon respond to this with the final question. Cynthia is asking, with the results in Kansas about the state referendum on abortion rights being soundly rejected, or the eliminating abortion rights in the state constitution being soundly rejected, Cynthia is asking, are there Democrats in rural places who just need a conversation in addition to conservative folks? What maybe was it some of those folks got engaged as well? What are your thoughts on that? Does it change the way you see things at all?
I'd love to hear Cynthia's answer to that question. I honestly have not been following it very closely, so I don't feel well informed enough to give a good response.
Cynthia, do you want to give your thoughts on it, and then we'll see if Canyon has anything to add? Cynthia, can you unmute? Did you want to elaborate any more, or just what your thoughts are about that? Well, she's still on mute. I don't know if she had to step away, but Canyon, did you have anything any insights or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak that much from our experiences in Maine, since voter turnout there is through the roof. I think it's one of the highest turnout states anywhere. But I could imagine in a place like Kansas or more conservative states that probably there are plenty of Democrats who have very well given up hope that their voice, their vote can have any impact at all, and that reaching them with a conversation and focusing on that turnout can make strides in a way that that isn't the case in a place like Maine.
Okay. All right. I'll just point out again from the chat that Edward has some really thoughtful responses to this question of federal and local control. And he's enumerated a really strong response there. So check that out. Erica, if you'd ask the final question, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure, thanks. Chloe, you mentioned that you encountered a lot of, like disillusionment and cynicism with politics and politicians, and that you share a lot of that and were able to empathize. And then I'm wondering if, like, from there, did you ever like say anything about then how you would act differently as a politician, or did you just sort of leave it by implication, by like role modeling, being, the lovely, kind, empathetic person that you are? Or did you sort of try and like drive the point home, like, yeah, and here's what I'm going to do differently?
I think the first time I ran, I just asked people to have some faith, and then really was, I felt like I took those promises really seriously, and really tried to live up to that word while I was in office. And so really being thoughtful about my votes and not voting party line, and always having constituent hours, and having, I had relationships with some key folks who weren't Democrats in the community who I could go talk to and kind of get their feedback on tricky bills and whatnot. And then, so then when I ran again in 2020, it was a lot easier to go around and say, hey, this is what I've done. You can look at my voting record, like have some proof there. But oh my goodness, I did feel like it was really tricky, because I felt like I was showing up and our whole campaign was showing up with like this new attitude, and everything really was so different. And I'd never break a promise, but no one knows me. They just see like another politician who's trying to swindle them out of any shred of hope or decency they have left. And so it just takes a lot of work to overcome that. And I think a key part of it too was, sorry for all the dogs, was having lots of conversations with people, like doing multiple passes through a universe, and all that kind of stuff.
Canyon, did you want to add anything to that? No. Any final words, Canyon or Chloe, before we close up?
Just a huge shout out to Cody and Erica and Anthony for this group and creating these spaces. Thank you, and to all of y'all for showing up and for the good work you're doing out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ditto. Thank y'all so much. This is such an amazing group.
Great, much appreciated. In September, we're going to have an excellent briefing with a fellow named Paulo Chimidas, and in October, we're going to have a panel of people, including Cynthia Wallace and 2 or 3 others who are engaged in different forms of these community works initiatives to rebuild trust and listen to people locally. So stay tuned. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks, Chloe and Canyon. Just a great conversation. Could have gone on for at least another hour.
Maybe we'll have them back.
It's so
care.
much,
Thanks so much.
so much to chew on. And Edward's input, the chat expanded a lot of thoughts as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well,
Lot of
Yeah.
people in the chat.
Go enjoy the sunshine before they charge and hope for rain.
Yeah.